Hello, I'm Stuart Craner, one of the founders of the Thinkers50. Welcome to this unique Thinkers50 webinar in partnership with ECSI Consulting. Our theme today is agility, agility incorporated, organizational agility in practice, what it takes to be an agile organization, what it takes to be an agile executive. We'll be asking those questions from esteemed experts with us today. So first of all, thank you very much for joining us from throughout the world. You'll see on your screen there's a chat box, so please feel free to let us know where you're from or any other issues you want to highlight for us. There's also a Q&A box, so please, webinars are a very egalitarian and democratic format, so please feel free to put in your questions for our experts today throughout the webinar. I'll be monitoring the questions and I'll make sure they get through one way or another. Our format today is very, very simple. Our experts will each speak for 15 minutes, giving their insights from their work in the field of agility and organizations. And after they're finished sharing their insights, then we'll take questions from the assembled masses. So it should be a really interesting discussion, because we have two fantastic experts with us today. I'm really pleased that we're joined by Dori Clark from the Thinkers50 ranking. The Thinkers50 ranking ranks the 50 most important management thinkers in the world, and Dori joined their ranks in 2019. I'm surprised we have to wait so long, actually, because Dori has a great track record, 4 brilliant books: Entrepreneurial You, Reinventing You, Stand Out, and Stand Out Networking. She's going to be hard at work during the summer, working on a brand new book, which will come out in 2021 on the power of long-term thinking. And Dori's career is really an exercise in agility. She's got a master's in theological studies. She was a former presidential campaign spokeswoman. She's producer of a Grammy-winning jazz album and directed an environmental documentary film called The Work of 1,000. So she teaches at Duke University. And there's probably other skills and experiences which she'll share with you as well, but quite an impressive resume. So really pleased that Dori has joined us today. We're also joined today by Alessandro Di Fiore. He's the founder and CEO of ECSI Consulting. Alessandro first came to our attention a few years ago when he started talking about the insight-driven organization, a really interesting idea. Then he went on to do research and talk about the role of judgment in the age of big data. Again, another interesting idea. And more recently, in his prolific contributions to the Harvard Business Review, Alessandro has been talking about agility, and he has real experience of working with organizations in both Europe and America, actually putting agility into practice. It's worth checking out Alessandro's latest Harvard Business Review articles, and one really interesting one about the role of agility in planning, which you would have thought is kind of contradictory terms, agility and planning, but he's also looked at the role of agility in science-driven organizations and the role of agility in corporate activities such as performance reviews. So we're really delighted that Alessandro has joined us today. So before we get started with Dori and Alessandro, just a reminder that they're going to talk for 15 minutes each. After that, we're going to be taking questions. I can see people filling in the chat function. Some questions are coming in already. Please feel free to fire in the questions, because if we can't deal with them now, I'm sure Alessandro and Dori will deal with them afterwards or at some time in the future. So please let the questions come in. So first of all, I'd like to hand the virtual stage to Alessandro for the first 15-minute session.
Thank you, Stuart. Thank you for the presentation. I have here a few slides I would like to share with the audience, and just to provide a framework on agility and provide also some of the insights from the actual execution of agile organizations in Europe and United States we've been doing in the last 5 years. First of all, let's start from a definition. At least this is a definition I like. There are many out there. There is the Agile Manifesto. But no, that's the one I like. I consider Agile or agility as part of something which is larger, a larger movement in direction toward a more human and dynamic organization. So I think part of this movement is also design thinking. Part of this movement is also lean experimentation and lean prototyping. Is about building a dynamic organization and dynamic capabilities, human center, in such a way that we can adapt to market changes rapidly and keeping the customer and the user at the center. So this is just to provide a framework. But no, I want to fundamentally cover two key points, which are two misunderstandings or misconceptions, because the word agility is used in so many different situations and contexts. But no, to make it more clear, I think is a distinction between agility and agile in project management and organizational agility is necessary. So when we speak about agility in project management, it's about methodologies. There are a number of different methodologies on how to be more effective in a team, in a project team. It can be permanent or project-based. The most famous one is a Scrum methodology, but it's fundamentally how can we work more effectively and dynamically in teams using concepts like sprint planning, sprint review, time boxing, feedback based on users, on iterations. But it's still a methodology supporting the way to work in projects, which is very different from organizational agility. And that's a clear misconception out there in the practitioners and in some of the companies. So you need to keep very clear the distinctions, because organizational agility is about organizational design, organizational development, which usually is a team-based organizational model where the teams can use some of the Scrum methodologies to be more effective in performing, and is including also the culture, the principles, and some of the key processes. So when we see the panel of our clients in Europe and the United States, talking about mid-size and large corporations, we see that most of the companies stop at level 1. So what we consider level 0 is Agile in information technology. Even in large companies, that's where Agile and Scrum was born. So you can apply to software development, you can apply to IT projects. So this is a no-brainer. And I think most of the large corporations today, they transformed their IT function in the way of working in Agile. Then a few companies, they take Agile practices and methodologies and apply to projects outside information technology, for example, in product development. And we call this level 1. But no, only 10% of the companies, they go to level 2. And this is what we call a full organizational agility. Only 10% of the company, they go to a real transformation in terms of organizational design, processes, leadership behaviors, culture, team-based models. And that's what we call full Agile. And that's where most of the benefits are. If you stop at level 0, level 1, probably you are chasing the benefits of a productivity at team level, which are in the range of 10 to 30% of productivity increase. But no, if you move to level 2, we are talking about benefits not only related to productivity, but also hitting products aligned to customer and user needs, and customer engagement, including employee engagement, which are increasing significantly. So why very few companies go to level 2 is because there is a fear, particularly at leadership level, because to go to level 2, fundamentally you create a bottom-up organization where the teams are self-managing and they have autonomy. So there is a fear that the old-fashioned control model and hierarchical model, this is going away. So how can I understand if they're making the right decisions? So this is is something which is obviously the leaders are feeling, and unless you have a number of very aspirational and they believe into it leaders, particularly the CEO and the first line, that's difficult for companies to go to level 2. Let me show an example. So this is an example of a pharma company going through a full transformation. That's the way it works. So you have a function or a unit, let's call drug development and commercial officer. So this is an organizational unit. And below this unit, you have a number of chapter. In other organizational models, they are called tribes. So fundamentally, what is a chapter? Is a cluster of agile teams. And this cluster of agile teams is organized, in the case of this company, by therapeutic area. And those teams are teams working in clinical development. So we are in pharmaceutical, we're not applying in information technology, but we're applying this in clinical development. And an agile team is composed by a coach, a product owner, and a number of members. Those are core or can be ad hoc. In this case, the company decided that they can have also ad hoc members joining the team only for one sprint or a couple of sprints. And you can see that the core and ad hoc members are coming from the functions, from the traditional functions, but when they are assigned to an agile team, they report to the team. When they are part of the team full-time, the team is autonomous in making decisions. So what happens is you avoid the back and forth of going to the function to make decisions. Because that's the problem. When you have a multifunctional team, but you don't have a truly agile organizational design, the people in the team, they go back to the functions, they ask to the functions for authorization to make decisions, they go back to the team, they go back to the function for doing something, they go back to the team. So the team is not autonomous, and there is a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of time wasted in this back and forth, but particularly the team doesn't have inside all the skills and the powers to make decisions and drive in a rapid way execution and decisions. So if you go, and the other point I wanted to make is all this agility debate and the literature is all about teams, yeah? Is all about how can I use agile methodologies to work in a better way in teams. They can be project teams, they can be permanent teams. But no, first of all, the first message of this page is not all the tasks are fit for teams. So you can have people on the shop floor in manufacturing. This is a factory model. So there is a routine task which is repeated a number of times. You really don't need a team there because it's an individual job. It's a routine task. You know how to do it. You do it in an efficient way more and more, many, many times again. But also there are some individual tasks, they are ambiguous. So the question is, how can we be agile when there is an individual job and the individual need to make a call fundamentally? And all the literature is about agility in teams, but there is nothing about addressing the agility for individual jobs and individual tasks. So how do we do that? Here is an example. So think about, this is a bank, is a mid-sized bank in Midwest in the United States. And you know, like in any banks, if you are going to a branch, you ask a loan, even if you are perfectly aligned to the policy in terms of credit scoring, no, you still need to have a signature, not only of the clerk and the person who is serving you at the branch, one level up, probably two level ups, or maybe three levels up, because no, this is a bank, so they like to have a lot of a signature before authorizing you a loan. So this is called a preventive control model. All the companies are in a preventive control model. Before you do anything, there is a signature, there is an authorization from someone who is on top of you. And any preventive control model is slowing down decisions, creating bureaucracy, and reducing employee engagement, because it is a fundamentally part of the issue of a bureaucratic system in a command and control organization. So what happened at Affinity, they created like a constitution they call MOE, and in this constitution, fundamentally they told the employee, use your judgment. Now, even if there is a policy, but you believe that for the client, there is a better judgment decision, use your judgment, divert from the policy, and do whatever is necessary for the customer. but no, be prepared to defend your action or your decision. And that's the way they do systematically. So if there is an exception to the policy and they go for it, they just need to document in the rationale why they didn't follow the policy for doing a better service for the client, and they document it. And the documentation is in the internal system, which is called Touch, and the documentation stays there. Nobody's looking at it unless the boss is looking at it, and the documentation is not self-explanatory, and maybe you can ask a meeting. But fundamentally, they are moving from a system which is a preventive control model to a detection-based control model. So you make the decision, you go for your judgment, and you are free to do it. You just document. In 90% of the cases, nobody's asking you, but no, because the decision and the documentation is transparent, and maybe someone is asking you why you made that decision. In that case, it's only detection. It's a post. It's after the decision is taken. So you are fundamentally cutting all the bureaucracy. And I will stop here because I think that the individual task and the individual jobs and the agility in the individual job, in addition to how we work agile in teams, in a team-based organization, are important to transform in a full agile organization.
Thank you, Alessandro, for those insights. So I think a couple of things before we move on to Dori. If you move to level 2, you're talking about a full cultural transformation, aren't you?
Yeah, in the model, yes, it's level 3, it's a full cultural transformation. So it's about the organization, it's about the culture and the values, it's about leadership behaviors, particularly because there is a different leadership style that we need to make those bottom-up organization to work. And it's also about processes. If you think about Stuart, if you think about procurement, is one example. No, you work in an agile team, and that team is supposed to deliver a first increment in 2 weeks sprint, and then it's an information technology or software development, but you need to onboard someone from outside, and then your procurement. And to onboard someone from outside, like a vendor or like a freelancer, it's taking months because you need a competitive bid, a request for proposal. What is that? So you need to think about processes which are fundamentally creating a barrier on agile. And one is procurement, the other one is performance management, the other one is strategic planning and budgeting. So unless you change the budgeting, also the budgeting needs to be agile, because otherwise you create a fixed allocation of resources, you cannot be agile. So those are key processes that need to be changed in addition to culture and leadership and organization in a full agile model.
Thank you to Vern Schellinger for the question about cultural transformation. I see from the chat box that we're joined by people from the Democratic Republic of Congo, Justin Kinnear from Dublin, somebody from Trinidad and Tobago, Jill Harvey from Rainey, Lincolnshire, somebody from Panama, Kenya, Oman. It's fantastic to hear from you all. Now I'd like to hear from our second speaker of this afternoon, or this morning, depending on where you are, and that is Dori Clark. Dori, the virtual stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Stuart, and thanks, Alessandro, for that great presentation. I'm excited to be here and to share some thoughts. I'm actually going to go ahead and share my screen because I have a few slides to share with you guys as well. So right now, over the past decade, I have spent a lot of time thinking about areas that are what I will call agility adjacent. My first book was Reinventing You. My most recent one is called Entrepreneurial You. And at their heart, they really both concern the question of how do we adapt to changing circumstances, sometimes rapidly changing circumstances, as we have seen over the past few months, and make sure that we land on our feet and are able to be successful over the long term as a result. And so I live in New York City. That's actually where I'm coming to you from now. I live down in the financial district right by Wall Street. And as you can imagine, in most places around the world over the past few months, there have been some dramatic transformations. But outside of Italy, where Alessandro is spending his time, New York has been one of the places that has been hardest hit and most affected. And so when Stuart and Alessandro approached me about doing this webinar and participating on the theme of agility, I thought immediately about my local circumstances, and I wanted to share some, I guess you could say, anthropological insights or some ground up insights about what I've been thinking about over the past few months. In New York, we have not had a stay-at-home orders per se. They have told us, don't be doing a lot of things, but we are allowed to get out and walk. The problem is just there's not a lot of things to do because everything has been shut down or dramatically curtailed. And as a result of that, businesses have had to be pretty clever about how they are adapting. And so I have taken upon myself to document a little bit the retail phenomenon, which I think in many ways, if we're talking about the individual level or even the broader enterprise level, can be useful as we think through what agility really means. So one of the questions that just about everybody asked themselves during the pandemic, and I think in one way or another has to ask ourselves regularly, is this constant question, this constant refrain: how can I serve my customers, my existing customers, in a different way? And in many ways, when it comes to change and how to be agile in the face of that, this is kind of the first order question, right? If the door is blocked, how can we get in through the window? And so you can see here on the right, this is right near my house. This is a really, sorry about that. This is a really lovely area called Brookfield Place that's right on the Hudson River. And normally in the summertime, it is a bustling place. People are eating and drinking and hanging out. You can see what they have implemented here. How can I serve my customers in a different way? They have created a QR code so that they can have touchless online ordering. You click on the QR code, you place your order, and they now have socially distant dining that has been set up. So that's one sort of small adaptation. It's not a huge one, but it enables them to stay in the game and to stay in business. Now, another question that businesses had to ask themselves, that we all have to ask ourselves, is a slightly different one. This is maybe a sort of second order question, which is, well, what else could I sell to my customers? This is a shot from an Indian restaurant in the East Village in New York City. It's a very good place. I recommend it if you come through. It's called Desi Gali. And they are normally just a regular Indian restaurant, but of course, there's no dine-in seating right now. So what they have done, in addition to serving takeout food, which they're allowed to do, is they have transformed themselves into an Indian grocery as well as a regular restaurant. And a lot of restaurants have been doing this. They literally just looked in their storeroom and said, well, what do we have around here that people could buy or that people want? This is not in the picture, but they literally are selling toilet paper because they knew people needed toilet paper. They're selling, you can see it's all the ingredients that they have. It's ketchup, it's flour, it's sugar, and they're selling provisions because they were forced to think creatively about, well, what do we have around that people want? And then another question, yet another important question that people are asking is, how can I leverage what might be underutilized resources? And this one it makes me laugh because frankly, it's very random, but this is in many ways the essence of entrepreneurial thinking. This is in a kind of working class neighborhood in New York called Washington Heights. This is actually where Lin-Manuel Miranda from Hamilton fame grew up. His first musical was In the Heights. And so in the Heights, there's this one kind of beachhead of gentrification, which is a kind of yuppie coffee shop called Tazo. And Tazo, of course, was decimated by the fact that you are no longer allowed to eat in the coffee shop. You're no longer allowed to hang out in the coffee shop. And so the owner apparently had a side interest in antiques. And so he closed one weekend and he took out all the seating, all the benches, and he decided you can see on the sign on the left, he is now a coffee shop, a wine bar, and an antique shop. I mean, why? Who knows? Because he just had this stuff. But he said, this is what it's going to take to survive, is I have these things and I'm going to sell them. And so much of agility is about responding to forcing functions in creative ways and not being paralyzed the way that so many people are. And so I have been really heartened in the midst of this crazy pandemic by the creative thinking that people have done, and the things that they're testing and trying. Will this work? I mean, who knows? I'm not sure that people desperately need his kind of random wine glasses and Remington typewriters, but maybe they do. And we would not know it if we did not test it. And so these kind of case studies, these on the ground examples, lead me to three ideas, three principles that I wanted to just share and tee up before we go into the broader discussion with Stuart and Alessandro and your questions. The first one, these are things that I talk about in my book, Entrepreneurial You. I have, we're at my desk here, so I have a prop. Here's the latest one, Entrepreneurial You. And this is a story that I tell about a guy named Todd Herman. And Todd is someone who I think is also a really good example of entrepreneurial thinking. He, years ago when he was starting his business, he was a youth sports mindset coach. This is kind of a niche business. He would coach young athletes on having the mindset for success. So how do you get clients for that? He did not have a lot of money for advertising, but what he did do is he said, well, what do I have? One thing he had was time, and another thing that he had was he was a good public speaker. And he said, all right, I'm gonna max that out. And so what he did, he lived in Western Canada, and he literally reached out to every single youth sports organization in Western Canada. And he said, I will come speak to you for free. My only stipulation, this is smart, is that for every kid who's there, at least one parent has to be there, because of course the parents were the buyers of the coaching services. So he went all in. Over a 90-day period, he gave over 60 talks to these youth sports organizations. And in fact, he was able to get a lot of new clients from it. It was a great way in a short period of time to expose himself to new audiences. But unexpectedly, I mean, this is what happens when we put ourselves out there. He was able to grow his business in directions he did not even anticipate, because some of the parents in attendance said, Todd, this stuff is great. Do you do it for adults? Which of course he didn't, but as an entrepreneurial thinker, he said, sure. And so he ended up with his very first clients as a national hockey league team and the Canadian government. He started with these blue chip clients and was able to build his, what is now an executive coaching business for adults from that. So I think the question in terms of agility is, well, what do we have? In almost all circumstances, there are suboptimal things. There's things we're missing. Maybe we're missing time. Maybe we're missing money. Maybe we're missing certain skills, but you have something. And the question is, how do we leverage that effectively? Number two is also a story that I tell in Entrepreneurial You. This is a gentleman named Danny Eny. He's from Canada. And Danny was very early in the wave of online learning and online courses. I mean, now in the pandemic, everybody's on board with that. This has gone very mainstream. But you go 8 years ago, 10 years ago, it was not. It was a very nascent idea that was kind of unproven. But Danny really believed in it. So he spent 6 months of his life creating an online course in marketing, which was his specialty. And after doing that, after 6 months, he launches it to the world. So exciting. And one person buys it. It was terrible. It was devastating. And he realized he had totally messed up. He was so sad and kind of burned by it, frankly. But he kept returning back to the idea of online learning. He kept saying, maybe I just did it wrong, because this is a thing. This is going to be a trend. And of course, he was not wrong. But what he decided to do a couple of years later, when he finally was in a position to return to online learning, he said, I'm never going to do it that way again. And what he did, this ties in with what Alessandro was talking about with these agile development methods, this lean startup methodology. What he did this time around was, instead of spending 6 months to create a course, what he did was he spent an hour creating a one-page sales document. And he sent an email to his list. He said, hey, I am thinking about creating a course. Here's what the course would be. If you are interested, click here, pay X amount of money. You can get in as a beta tester at a very discounted price. And so he hadn't put in a lot of effort up front. He was able to just test it to see if people wanted it. And critically, it's not, it's very easy for people to say, oh yeah, that's a good idea. He made them put money down to really see if they wanted it. And this time they did. This time he had 50 people sign up during this trial period. So he knew he was onto something, and he was able to create a course, bespoke course, based on what his actual learners wanted. So we have to place small bets. We have to always ask ourselves at an individual level and at an enterprise level, how do we spend an hour testing something rather than 6 months creating something only to see it fail? How do we make those very small bets? And the third and final piece that I want to share before I hand things back to Stuart for your questions and our discussion is just the attitude that when it comes to the question of agility, frankly, we have to re-envision ourselves as detectives in many ways. We have to learn to scan the horizon, to not just be satisfied with, oh, well, this is the answer, and clearly this is the permanent answer, right? What we know is that in the modern world, there is nothing that is the permanent answer. What we know is there are certain behaviors, certain skills, certain ways of doing things that work in one context that are very much not going to work in another. And so we need to be willing to investigate and to ask ourselves questions. And in fact, my three favorite questions, which I will frame for you in hopes that they might be helpful, this is what I try to ask myself often, is number one, have the facts changed? Have the circumstances changed? And if they have, what is the implication? I mean, just as a sort of simple example, right? Lots of people for a long time thought that taxis were terrible. I mean, you know, they were, I think, probably better in London where Stuart is, but in New York, I mean, people were always griping about taxis. Oh, they're unreliable. You can never get them when you want them. They all smell like cigarette smoke. They overcharge, whatever it is. A lot of people complained about it, but until the advent of the smartphone, there was not really much you could do about it. But once the smartphone was created with the embedded GPS, it made Uber possible. It made Lyft possible. So what have the facts changed? It could be a technological fact, a socio-political fact, a cultural fact, but it has implications. That's number one. Number two, what are the alternatives? So often, especially if we are experts, we settle too quickly on what the answer is, the right answer. Well, the truth is, because the right answer is often changing, we need to disabuse ourselves of this. And this is where techniques like, the pre-mortem, which you guys perhaps are familiar with, the idea of sort of forecasting, if this were to go wrong, why would it go wrong? It's about scenario planning and thinking through, all right, what are the range of possibilities before we get fixed and settled on something? We have to force ourselves to evaluate what the other possibilities are. And third and finally is the question of how do you maintain optionality? If we are existing in very uncertain circumstances, which, right now, certainly we are, I think oftentimes in general we are. If there's a lot of uncertainty, of course, it makes sense that we would like to gather more information before making a firm decision. But we don't know when that additional information is going to come. We just have no idea. And so we can't be paralyzed. We can't just say, oh, well, I'll do nothing for the next 3 years until things sort themselves out. That's not a good idea either. So the question is, how do we make small decisions? How do we do things that enable us to maintain as many options as possible so that we can move forward a little bit, but still have that optionality so that we can be able to reverse course, change course, or pivot as we need to. Those are the principles that I like to think about when it comes to questions of agility. And I hope it might be helpful to you. And so thank you guys. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Stuart. Thank you.
Brilliant, Dory. Thank you very much. Lots of questions coming in. Let's start with a context-related one. Is there a difference between the way agility is perceived in Europe to the way it's perceived in America? Perhaps I can ask Alessandro that, seeing he's Italian but spends a lot of time in Boston, where ECSI has got an office. Is there a difference in interpretation and practice in Europe and in the States?
No, I don't see that. I don't see different interpretation and practice. I think the difference is about the culture you can have in some companies compared to other companies, or in some countries where the predominant culture of that country is affecting fundamentally the culture of the company. For example, I make an example, the ING Bank, which is the most known and one of the successful full agile transformation cases, which is documented at INSEAD with 3 cases in London Business School and I think also Harvard Business School. So it's a very well documented case. So there was the chief operating officer of Netherlands who decided for a big bang organizational transformation and with great results. No, the results are documented. The same person was then hired in one of the largest banks in Russia. And he tried something similar there, didn't work out. There was a full pushback over the organization. And that was probably I'm just doing an hypothesis here related to a very top-down hierarchical power ostentation-based type of a culture in some of the companies and organizations in that part of the world. So I think it's the company's culture, which is the most important, and as a consequence, the leadership. Unless you have a leader who is behind that, that's very difficult to fly. Yeah?
Can big companies really be agile, or is it an impossible task? Alessandro?
No, we have examples of big companies who have been successful. They're still working on it. Yeah. For example, one of my clients in Italy, Enel, which is the largest utility in the world, excluding the Chinese ones, yeah, and Bosch in Germany. They've been going through an agile transformation. Bosch started 5 years ago, Enel 4 years ago. And they are continuing to progress in a full agile transformation, which is not only information technology, but also touching the business part. And they've been quite successful also in terms of metrics and performances. So it's not easy. It's a multi-year journey. And you need a leader and a number of leaders who really stick to it and believe into it. But no, it is possible. It is actually possible. But there are very few companies. Those 2 companies I mentioned too, if I look at the Fortune 500, there are very, very few large Fortune 500 who embarked in a full agile transformation. Another one is Roche, but it's early on in the transformation. But no, they went through, or they are going through a full agile transformation.
I think one of the best examples I've ever come across is the Chinese company Haier, the biggest white goods manufacturer in the world. And there was an article in the MIT Sloan Management Review by Howard Yu and Mark Greven about how Haier was able to recover from the pandemic much quicker than its competitors because it uses self-managing teams, there's lots of autonomy for people, it focuses on zero distance with customers, and it fulfilled 99% of its orders in February, and it's based in China, so that was the height of the pandemic, really. So it is interesting how the pandemic has fed into agility. Let's move on to another question. Well, actually, this is not a question. This is kind of an observation from Sunil Mundra. Says there are 3 underlying capabilities to Agile: sense, adapt, respond. So is Sunil right, or is he missing something, Dory? Sense, adapt, respond.
I think that
it seemed pretty good to me.
I think that pretty much covers it. Well put, Sunil. I think that's great. I mean, ultimately, when it comes to sussing out the landscape, I mean, the sort of detective metaphor that I was talking about, I think ties in with sense. And we do need to take action in the moment, small actions and small steps, as we were discussing. And then there needs to be a feedback loop. I think the problem so often with whether it's large corporations or even us as individuals is that we somehow relax our guard and assume that if we've done something once that, okay, now it's set, now I can move on to the next thing and I don't have to worry about that anymore. And I think that constant vigilance sounds a little too sort of surveillance state, but in a broad sense, that is what I mean, that we need to accustom ourselves not to making a decision once and never revisiting it, but to having processes in place for ourselves so that we understand that the norm is that things will be changing and we need to make small modifications in the moment, you know, every month, every quarter, whatever it is, so that we don't have to make massive adaptations every 5 years or 10 years and find ourselves flat-footed and out of business.
What about the attitude to failure? Because it seems to me agility suggests a speed of action, which means that failure in small steps might mean small failures, but it means our attitude to failure is going to be different, doesn't it?
I think that's exactly right. However, the part that I like to push back on and to sort of reframe is that failure is an interpretation, right? Because when I think about what failure is or isn't, to me, a failure is something that we really expected to go one way and then it just didn't. You know, somebody screwed up or things didn't work and oh no, it was a failure. If we go into everything saying this is an experiment, we don't know how it is going to come out, that is not a failure. That is data collection. That is actually part of the process. And it's sort of homing in on what the correct answer is. But it is a recognized necessary part of it. And so I think the real question for us is how can we be placing those small bets so that we never put so much on the table that we have everything at risk. You know, if I'm placing a 10-cent bet every day, I honestly don't care if I lose that bet. If I win, fantastic. If not, it's not going to kill me. It's not going to kill my company. If I'm placing a $100,000 bet every day, then that could kill me pretty fast. And so we need to make bets that are small enough that if it fails, I say in air quotes, it really doesn't matter.
Yeah. And Stuart, I think, and Dory, I can build on this. I think here, the methodologies can help. If you think about lean experimentation, you can apply lean experimentation to new products, even to new strategies. And you develop a concept, you prototype the concept, very quickly you go there and you are testing it. And you test it with a video, with a storyboard. Also, we tested some business models just based on a couple of PowerPoints with the customers and potential customers. And so what is that? Is that failure, or are you doing an adjustment and a validation of your critical assumptions behind the strategy of the product and changing before the traditional approach was I was developing a full product and then big bang, and then that was a failure. I think that was a failure. Even in Scrum, where you have sprint cycles over 2-3 weeks, at the end of each sprint, you can have a feedback from the user, from the customer, or from the internal customer, and then move on. So the methodology helps because it's fundamentally creating shorter cycles, small bets, like you say, Dory, and or lean prototype, using another jargon, and you can test on them and then pivot and change, iterate, and get it better. That's why when you use agility from a methodology standpoint, even the net present score goes up on average based on global benchmarking studies of 30-50%, because now you are following that process, that the user is at the center, and you have a constant feedback, so you improve your product and service or your strategy overall along the cycle you are designing it.
So there is no failure, only feedback, says Pamela.
Exactly. And by the way, let me talk about this failure, because now I saw some companies going, too, at least in my view, too much and celebrating failure. And I don't think there is anything to celebrate about failure. No, you use in the culture, in your processes, in your way of working, a failure, if there is a failure, is a way to learn. If a failure is due to incompetence or lack of a discipline in checking facts, that's not something to celebrate, no? And it's, because I saw some of those global awards of big corporations about failure celebration, but no, some of them, they were just due to incompetence. Why are you celebrating that? Yeah. So be careful.
Yeah. There's a good point by Chandan McPaul. Says that Agile with a capital letter is a methodology. Agile, lowercase agile, is a mindset, a way of working. And somebody's followed up saying agility is a verb. And I've got a sense from the comments we're getting through and what the two of you have been talking about, that agility is moving from the preserve of the IT department and something associated with processes and IT to something much more human. Do you get the impression that things are heading in your direction, really, Dory?
I think that's absolutely true. I mean, ultimately, it's useful for all of us as professionals to borrow whatever methodologies we can to help us make better decisions and be able to have tools in our arsenal. And I think that a lot of the innovation that's come out of the tech world around this has been quite valuable, because fundamentally we're trying to solve the same problem in our businesses as we are in our lives, which is circumstances are changing. They're changing very rapidly. And as these things are accelerating, how do you make good decisions, the best decisions possible under conditions of uncertainty? And frankly, I guess if you're surveying people, the stakes are even higher in our own lives, because it's not just a business project that might not work. It's a question of our lives and our calling and where we're going, and what are we doing with ourselves to earn the money that we need and to find the meaning that we need. And so having arrows in our quiver about how we can do that, how we can pivot so that we are able simultaneously to make the right decisions so that we can have a successful and a meaningful career, even when the world sometimes feels like it's collapsing around us. I think that agility is a very useful resource for that.
And Stuart, if I can add one point on this, this is an incredible, important aspect for successful implementation. So when you apply only the Agile methodology, whatever it is the methodology, it can be Lean Startup, it can be Scrum, whatever, Scrum-Ban, and there are so many out there. So, but when you apply the methodology in the way you are working in a team, that's about the mechanic. So I do the sprint. The sprint is 2 weeks. I do the daily Scrum. I do the Lean prototyping. That's the way I use the Lean prototyping. It's about the mechanic. What we notice in our implementation experience is that when you try to apply the methodology to few teams and you don't change the rest of the organization, particularly the behaviors, particularly the leadership behaviors, that fails, because there is no way to isolate those teams. So if you want a team which is autonomous, but then you are not changing the behaviors, particularly of the leaders, and the leader is coming to a sprint review after 2-3 weeks and is intervening and changing completely the decision and the direction of that team. So you're jeopardizing the full spirit, and obviously the motivation of the team will go down. So, and it's the same for the process example I mentioned before. If you don't change budgeting, how can you adjust to the pandemic change of allocation of resources if you have a very fixed and rigid budget? So you need to change the environment around the teams. And this includes the behaviors and the culture and the processes, and sometimes also the organizational design. So there is agility in methodology, and there is agility in the overall organization, including behaviors and culture, obviously.
A question that keeps coming up from people watching the webinar is the role of leadership. And it seems to me that agility starts with leadership, but it's a very different style of leadership than organizations have been used to over the last century or so. Are there signs that leaders in organizations now understand agility genuinely and are actually practicing it themselves?
That's my frustration as a consultant, Stuart. So I think they understand on paper, some of them maybe, but when they need to practice it, they fear, at least some of the leaders, they fear. That's why we only have a 10% on full organizational agility. 10% of companies, they move there. Because now, to go to a full organizational model, which is agile, you need to give up the traditional way to control, which is fundamentally the preventive control model we saw in the Midwest case. So before you make any decision, you come to me, I look at it, I sign, and I authorize you. And that's the way I control. And then, so to give that part away, or at least a part of that control model away, not all of them, and having more servant leadership. So you are coaching, intervening, providing your view in the teams, but no, you are not fundamentally changing any decision. It's a different type of leadership, and it's a little bit scaring, or some of the leaders they fear it. So leadership is a necessary condition to do it.
But turkeys tend not to vote for Christmas. Dori, what's your take on the leadership involved in creating agile organizations?
Well, I think Alessandro's point is very well taken, that ultimately the model that we have in our heads, the cultural model of what a leader is a leader is a person who knows things, who has a vision and makes decisions. And if that is the implicit model of leadership, A, the leaders themselves feel like they have to live up to that, and B, there's kind of a question skulking around in the back of people's minds that, oh, if I'm not doing that, if I instead reposition myself as more of a facilitator, then what is my actual value? Because they may well feel like, oh, I am ceding my power. I am making myself look interchangeable with other people because the decision is coming from the grassroots up rather than the top down. And so theoretically, the bad thinking would go, theoretically anyone could do it, and I am making myself a commodity. I am making myself replaceable. You feel irreplaceable if you were the person saying, this is the path forward, we will do it. However, as we have seen time and again, it's a little bit of a crapshoot whether this is the path forward is actually going to be effective or not. Oftentimes, it is not, because you don't have perfect information, and it's just a random guess. You will get better information if you do have the sensing mechanisms, if you do place the small bets and monitor it and come up so that you are never getting out over your skis. But to Alessandro's point, it's a different form of leadership. It is a subtler form of leadership. And I think that in terms of our own ego as leaders, it is something that is very difficult to adjust to in many ways.
Another question coming in, can agility be applied to any environment? So a lot of people are asking from the point of view of government. Can you get agile government? Do we want agile government? Can airlines, do we want our airlines to embrace agility? Is that what we want in airlines, or our health services? Yes and no, I think, is the answer. But how about government? Does agility apply to government? Well, obviously it doesn't at the moment.
Well, I will rephrase the question, Stuart. I don't think there is a yes or no by industry or by is public or private. I think there is a yes or no within a specific entity on the type of a task. And I want to go back to the matrix I presented. There are some tasks which are routine tasks, or some tasks that needs to be done based on regulation. So there are specs which are very well defined and you need to comply. So you don't need a team, you don't need to be agile. But in the same company, including the government, I assume, there are some areas and tasks where you do need a team to find solutions to novel problems and to find an agile way and do it rapidly, swiftly, and effectively, and also changing the way decisions are made. So in some industries, you have more of those individual tasks and routine tasks. Some others, you have more ambiguous tasks, so teams and agility, also individual agility are a better fit. But I think in each company you can find a cluster or a group of activities, or one or the other.
I think there's another related question, or somewhat related, from Anne-Marie Newton. It says, can Agile happen slowly? Agile is normally associated with speed, but certain activities, in the development of new drugs, there's a degree of slowness is kind of essential to do it properly. So can Agile happen in slow motion?
That's a good one. Dori, what's your take on this?
Yeah, I really love it, actually, because it's almost like sort of what a Zen master would ask you to meditate on. You know, think agile slowness. So yes, actually, I do think that they can coexist. I mean, it's true that when we think about the classic conditions where we see agility, you know, it's sort of like, oh, we're going to have a hackathon or something like that, and it's, you know, what can we bang out in the next 24 hours? And that is a really good constraint sometimes to force us to inhabit behaviors that we're not used to. But certainly, if we accept agility as a mindset and as a way of thinking, which I do, it is about customer responsiveness. It is about making sure that you are taking in data and making decisions based on that, rather than essentially creating something by fiat and shoving it down people's throats and saying, well, they'll want this. Instead, we are gathering the data and moving along. Now, it's certainly better in many circumstances to do that more quickly than not. But there are times, drug discovery, Stuart being a really good example, where you simply can't do that. I mean, if we're creating a COVID vaccine, for instance, it would be fantastic if we could figure out in a week if it worked or not. But that's not how it works. You need months to actually see, well, are these people who have been inoculated with the vaccine actually getting infected? Does it work over time? You can't rush that process. And so I think oftentimes there's agility in the thinking behind something. There can be agility in certain parts of the process, but oftentimes, you can't make the kettle boil faster. And so it may be a slow process overall, even if the thinking is fast and sharp.
By the way, I think the protagonist of this webinar is your cat, more than me and you and Stuart. I can see also from some of the comments and the chats here.
He's very agile, let me tell you that.
He's very agile, yeah, much more than us, for sure. Now, one more comment on I think speed is why it's so important to stress speed, because speed is coming from eliminating the waste in the decision-making process, the waste of the bureaucracy, the waste of the back and forth with the functional leaders when you have a traditional multifunctional team, but the team has no autonomy. But no, you are not cutting the time for making the right decisions. Actually, I will argue that because of this so many feedback cycles, you can make better decisions. Going through the small bets philosophy and the sprint philosophy that Dori mentioned before. So you are not cutting time for making the right decisions. You are cutting the waste time of the bureaucracy and the slowness in the back and forth in any company, any command and control type of a company. That's what we want to eliminate.
Go slow to go fast, says Elaine Rumble wisely in the comments. We are, having talked about fastness and slowness, we are out of time. So I'd like to thank Alessandro Di Fiore from ECSI Consulting for joining us. And thank you very much to Dori Clark for joining us from New York. Somebody commented in the chat box that you're far too humble, Dori. which is a very nice compliment. We really enjoyed your company, Dori and Alessandro, and really appreciate your insights. Some great comments. So I would encourage everybody who's participated to check out ECSI Consulting's website You will all be sent a copy of a new white paper, which Thinkers50 has produced alongside ECSI. I would also encourage you to check out Dory's work at doryclark.com, and all her books are recommended, and the book she's working on, which will come out next year, will be worth waiting for. So thank you very much, Alessandro, and thank you, Dory.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us. Goodbye.
Thank you.